And we are live. Hello, fellas. I should have the audio working properly. I'm just going to check this very quickly. Yep, right thing, right everything. How's everyone doing? Hope you're doing well. Today we're going to do something a little bit more structured than yesterday, and we're going to talk about an accusation, well, a bunch of accusations against St. Francis of Assisi. By Father Seraphim Rose, who's a rather famous 20th century Eastern Orthodox monk of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. Now, what drove me to do this was a mixture of wanting to get more involved with other faiths and talk about them, but also I read a hagiography, a very early hagiography of St. Francis of Assisi in this volume here on St. Bonaventure. And I was reading through parts of it, and I thought, well, I remembered the criticisms that I'd seen of Francis of Assisi by this particular part of the Orthodox Church, and I thought it doesn't really marry up very well, because I'm someone who does quite like the Philocalic tradition. I'm interested in that kind of thing. I've always liked Seraphim Rose since before I was even a Christian, let alone even a theist, really. Well, I mean, I suppose I would have been a theist because I was a kid. But I've always liked that kind of thing, and I've always had some awareness of it. Obviously not much as a child, much more now. And reading the life of St. Francis in this volume, for those who are interested, it's the Classics of Western Spirituality, Bonaventure. He reminded me kind of a St. Anthony of the Desert that walks around a lot more. Of course, he held a completely different kind of life, at least in terms of stability. He was living an apostolic life. He was living a life where there was moving about. There were still the vows of chastity and of poverty, but not of stability. There was also obedience, of course, as well. And so I think it's quite interesting, some of the criticisms that are brought up by Seraphim Rose. I'll warn you, he's not particularly nice to Francis. I'll say that, but I will warn everyone in the chat if there's any sort of meanness against orthodoxy or against Seraphim Rose, like just trying to dishonour the man for the sake of it. I will remove your comment because that's sinful. But please feel free to share this, and we'll get cracking. I also might talk a little bit in vagaries about other criticisms from other people of Francis, because I know that there's this view among some people that the stigmata are like this manifestation of demonic power, which I laugh at because I find it very difficult to consider the stigmata, at least of more contemporary saints, to be anything like that, because of the specific physical situation with them. But we'll address Seraphim Rose here specifically right now. So let's scroll down. He's come off of a bit of a discussion of the scholasticism and romance of the Middle Ages in Western Europe, presumably. So I'll just read out the bits verbatim where I'd like to respond, and to sort of give you a sense. So we've seen in the Middle Ages that rationalism, logicalness, replacing faith or taking over and shaping now faith, becoming the criteria of romantic elements entering in. This is a recorded lecture, so this is why it's very informal, and I suspect that's the reason why there are some pretty serious errors. There's at least one very serious error that I found in Seraphim's articulation of the project of this idea anyway. And now we've come to a very important concept, which is maybe even more important than scholasticism. So I don't know what he says about scholasticism. I haven't read this bit, but I find the accusation of logicalness, and I think this is very much a kind of a modern Eastern Orthodox kind of approach. I think this is held by a certain group within that church, that the West is too logical. And to be honest, having read both the scholastics and the fathers, there's a very specific scholastic method, but it isn't any more or less logical than what you find in the fathers. I mean, probably the best expressed example of this would be something like the Font of Wisdom by by St. John of Damascus, or at least one of the writings of St. John of Damascus. I think it was that one, where he starts talking in terms of something that looks like something out of Aristotle, right? There are other parts of on the exact exposition of the Orthodox faith where St. John of Damascus will actually bring up things that were considered contemporary science at that time. So he'll talk about the position of the stars, and he'll talk about the winds and stuff like this. It's very interesting to actually read the view of St. John of Damascus in this. And even further than that, even before that, you have people even very famously anti-logic early Christian writers like the Heretic, or at least the purported heretic Tertullian, who says, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? He, in his book Against Marcion, will use similar logical arguments to anybody like St. Thomas Aquinas. Anybody like St. Thomas Aquinas or St. Bonaventure. The difference is that there's been developments and growth of the seed of the faith. So you will see this kind of development, famously cited St. Vincent of Lorraine. So I don't like this kind of attack on logicalness, and not to mention the fact that in the East you have Byzantine scholasticism as well, and I've even heard some people say that other parts of the Orthodox communion did such. But that's kind of an aside, something that kind of irritates me when I read some takes like this. This is the concept of sanctity, which becomes now different from the Eastern Orthodox concepts of sanctity. So he's making a rigid distinction between Eastern Orthodox sanctity and Roman Catholic sanctity, and he further emphasizes this: the fact that the man was so popular, in fact tremendously popular wherever he went. People went around, acted like Christ himself coming to them, and they sang and accompanied him. So he's got this very, very popular attitude. Now, of course, it would be a straw man to point out that there are Orthodox saints who are like this, because this obviously isn't his point of view. He goes into more detail and he says the whole apostolic life of St. Francis is a massive issue. But yeah, obviously popularity in itself. And this is one of the cruxes of his points, actually. He continues on. For one thing, he founded a new manner of life. He invented the rule of poverty, because in church one day the gospel was preached about poverty. Now, I don't know how he could have invented the rule of poverty, since we have it in... I believe we have it in St. Benedict. I'm not sure if it's in Benedict. I think it is in Benedict, though. And I know for a fact that... actually, you know what? I've got the rule of St. Benedict right here, because I saw... There's another point. I'll just type poverty. Yeah, I don't think they take a vow of poverty, but I know for a fact that St. Anthony of the Desert, he actually, when he went out into the desert to become the great popularizer of the eremitical life in the 4th century, he did so on the exhortation to sell everything. And this is what he does. He sells everything. He gives part of it to his daughter so that they can be looked after by some other... I don't know if they would have been Cenobitic nuns at this point. But he does exactly this. This isn't him just inventing it out of nowhere. So the rule of poverty does not begin with Francis. So let's continue. The first time they went out, they went 2 by 2s to cities preaching to the Jews and took nothing with them. And he heard this in church and became inspired to invent a new rule, a new way of life, a rule of poverty based on the gospel, as though there was no monastic tradition before him, which there was. And there were many great saints at this time. Well, you see, the problem with Father Seraphim's assertion here is that, well, this was a time where Europe was growing in its urban centres. So, during the early Middle Ages, you had very much a situation where Europe was more rural, and so the monasteries had more of a social role and were more connected to the people. So you have these large Benedictine abbeys growing, and in the 11th century you have the development of the Cistercians and of the Carthusian orders. So you have this going on, but over time, particularly in Italy, Italy's always been a somewhat had always been a somewhat of an urbanized place, particularly in the north. But even more so, like it became more and more urbanized, and you had this division in the society between the monks that were very rural, and you had the townspeople who didn't have this. This wasn't a situation, at least so far as I understand from what I know of the High Middle Ages, this wasn't a situation like in the 5th century where you had monasteries and nunneries, or convents rather, like they were in Constantinople under St. John Chrysostom and St. Olympia. It was a much more diffuse situation where you'd have Benedictine abbeys dotted around the place that had their own land grants, and they would be largely rural. And so there was a situation where the monks were kind of isolated. They of course had the canons regular and stuff like this in the cities, and undoubtedly there was some Benedictine involvement, but it was kind of schismed a little bit. And this is the kind of world that St. Francis of Assisi comes into. And you already at the time of St. Francis, drives towards this kind of apostolic poverty granted in heretical movements. And Francis is in a position to make that orthodox as much as Seraphim Rose may wish to oppose this. I think that his issue here more is that there's something new. Actually, you know what? I'm not gonna be presumptive. I'll just continue. Of course, he could look around. Perhaps the monasteries were corrupt and so forth, and he wanted something different. But there's something already suspicious to think he's going to do something new. A whole new rule of life based not on the Holy Fathers. Well, I don't think that's based not on the Holy Fathers. And if he didn't like the recent Latin Fathers, he could have gone back to St. John Cassian, the Egyptian Fathers and so forth, but he didn't. He went instead to the Gospel, like the Protestants. Well, he was the son of a cloth merchant in Assisi. He wasn't somebody who had grand access to the Fathers, and he certainly wasn't contrary to them. In fact, one of the first things he does is he goes to the Pope, the Patriarch of the East, and gets affirmation for this. He goes to the authority, he goes to the magisterium, and goes and does this. Like, are you seriously trying to tell me that when the Egyptian monks themselves, in their particular situation, decided to go and become Cenobitics, do you think Pachomius had access to any of these other fathers? Did St. Paul the Hermit? They just... Like St. Paul the Hermit, he was in the situation under the Decian persecution, and that's what led to him becoming a hermit. You have Pachomius, who's known as the founder of Cenobitic monasticism, and he has his own situation as well. As far as any of us should be really concerned, and we will get into the really serious stuff here, there are certain ways of life that are necessary given certain circumstances, and you have the same thing in the Orthodox Church. You, of course, have the emphasis on a particularly Athonite monastic spirituality, but there are also different movements. And we'll go on to make it more clear later on in the stream where exactly these fit in. He went and invented himself a rule of poverty, which was affirmed by the institution of the Church. He went and got it confirmed by the Pope. Now, we may have our arguments about legitimate magisteria and whether Rome is in heresy or not. It isn't, but some people disagree. But he went through the appropriate channels. In fact, that's one of the things that Bonaventure, in his hagiography, is extremely insistent on. They were always in obedience to the Pope. They went to the Pope, as they should have, and as they would have gone to in the patristic era. Nothing special, of course, monks are poor, but he made something special of it. And this is where things get... Just as we'll see that the Catholics are making something special about the Mother of God, as though she's some kind of unearthly being and so forth. Okay. I'm just going to quickly check comments. Have you fellas got any comments? Mongoose Man says, would be great if you could maybe one day talk about other works of Seraphim Rose. I've read a couple of them, yeah. Okay, I can do that. Some people say that Paul had the stigmata. I didn't know that. I've never heard this before, actually. Hi, True Trader Waifu. Andy says, Chapter 33 is the relevant chapter of the rule that forbids private property. Oh, what? Of the rule of St. Benedict. Okay, I'm not particularly familiar with the rule of St. Benedict. The reason I've got it open is that he makes a rather interesting claim about the status of fasting. And, yes, he very specific... Okay, so there we go. Thanks a lot. Whether monks ought to have anything of their own. You see, I thought that they had a rule of property. Very especially, this is the vice of private ownership. Very especially is this vice of private ownership to be cut off from the monastery by the roots. Okay, I thought so. I didn't want to assume. I'm not somebody who assumes. I just thought I could just sort of control F poverty and find it. The right edge of the text is cut off, by the way. Don't know if it's in your view. Let me check the... okay. Yeah, okay, I'll just change that very quickly. My apologies, fellas. Oh, it's going to do that, isn't it? Okay, we'll just do this. That's better. Okay, there we go. Alright. So yeah. I had a feeling that St. Benedict did. I think it's very strange that Seraphim Rose would rake St. Francis of Assisi over the coals for something that St. Anthony of the Desert did. But, okay. Let's continue. They were not now to be called just monks. They were penitents of Assisi or the Lord's minstrels. I've never heard them called that. I'll just take his word for it. I always thought they were just called brothers. They called themselves going about singing. So we already see that they think they're not like previous monks and ascetics, but something new. A new spirit which is very much in accord with the spirit of the times. Okay. There was a time... actually, I'm going to skip this because I find the whole concept of Seraphim Rose getting angry at the whole Christmas crib thing that you have outside of the church to be kind of funny. Okay, I'll just read it out. There was a time on Christmas in the year 1223 he decided to celebrate the Nativity in a new manner. And so he reproduced in the church where he was in Italy the stable of Bethlehem. And thus begun the so-called devotion to the crib in the Latin Church, and around this he had some kind of play, which is beginning of the mystery plays in Italy, and helping thus to the rise of the drama. And the drama, of course, is something which, although it arose from this very same thing, we're not going to talk about. The mystery play, when it comes to liturgy, actually was centered around the mass and religious themes, and its adaptation to the new spirit of the times to make religion more interesting, more in accordance with everyday life, more close to believers, as though orthodoxy is not enough. Well, you see, the thing is that you need to actually provide a reason for people to even join the religion in the first place, for people to join them. Right? You don't just statically cease changing. The early church didn't do this. We have ecumenical councils showing that. You have your own Palamite councils. There is obviously going to be changes in the religion. It's not like it's going to be this static thing, because tradition is a living being. It's not like to say that the crib is some sort of repudiation of orthodoxy, meaning correct belief. It doesn't follow for me. Another aspect of his so-called sanctity, one historian of him says, his very asceticism is often clothed in the guise of romance. So he woos the Lady Poverty, thinks about her as though she's a real person, and keeps wooing her as the bridegroom, and of course about Sister Death and all these personifications. Well, I mean, it's not like that doesn't have somewhat of a scriptural root. I mean, you have Daniel asking aspects of the environment to praise the Lord. And a very typical example, and the romance thing, yeah, of course, we have the Song of Songs. So it makes sense that we would apply a romantic aspect to parts of our spiritual life. And a very typical example of something new, which is not at all orthodox, is what happened when he was sick. He ate meat. Oh, really? It's not orthodox, is it? Okay, so this is what was written in the 6th century. Moreover, Let the eating of flesh meat be conceded to the sick, and especially to those who are weak, for their recuperation, but when they shall have gotten better, let them abstain from flesh meat as usual. It's actually traditional. So don't tell me this isn't orthodox at all, unless you want to repudiate the entire Western tradition. Which I don't think the Orthodox really want anyway. He ate meat. And an Orthodox person who isn't a monk maybe might eat meat during sickness or something. If he did, he would feel repentant about it. Ask God's forgiveness. What? If he did, he would feel repentant about it. Ask God's forgiveness and feel that I'm no good anyway. And ask that if he would, God forgive him. But not Francis of Assisi. Instead, he went out to preach to the people. There was a large crowd. Thousands of people as usual. And this is one of the things that struck me when I was reading Bonaventure's work, because Bonaventure casts this in an entirely different light. Reminder, you're not to insult him in the chat for this. And he said, "Stop, everyone, stay here until I come back." And he went to the church nearby, and he forced 2 of his disciples to do whatever he told them out of obedience. Of course, this is what the Orthodox would have with their abbots, presumably, as well. I've never read the Rule of St. Basil, but it's the rule in the West, and I understand that that they have abbots as well, and I'd be very, very surprised if they didn't have rules of obedience like this. One of them poured over his head ashes, a bucket full of ashes, and a second put a rope around his neck and led him before the people, who were all waiting to see what's going to happen. And here comes Francis of Assisi, led by a rope with ashes on his black head, and he looks at them and says, "You consider me a saint, but I ate meat when I was sick." By this, he's making a public display of, I'm really supposed to be very holy. So basically he mocks the saint. I'm not going to repeat this. But I read this in Bonaventure's work, and you can find this. It's The Life of St. Francis by Bonaventure, which is the first official biography of St. Francis of Assisi. This comes from earlier works, like he'll quote from an earlier work by Thomas of Celano a little later on. But this is the one that was agreed on by the Franciscan order, was printed, and each of the houses that the order owned had to have a copy. So we will read how Sir Bonaventure characterizes this. In order to render himself contemptible to others, he did not spare himself the embarrassment of bringing up his own faults when he preached before all the people. Once it happened that when he was weighed down with sickness, he relaxed a little the rigour of his abstinence in order to recover his health. When his strength of body returned, he was aroused to insult his own body out of true self-contempt. "It is not right," he said, "that the people should believe I am abstaining while in fact I eat meat on the sly." Inflamed with the spirit of true humility, he called the people together in the square of the town of Assisi and solemnly entered the principal church with many of the friars whom he had brought with him. With a rope tied around his neck and stripped to his underwear, he had himself dragged before the eyes of all to the stone where criminals receive their punishment. He climbed up upon the stone and preached with much vigour and spirit, although he was suffering from a fever and the weather was bitter cold. He asserted to all his hearers that he should not be honoured as a spiritual man, but rather he should be despised by all as a carnal man and a glutton. So that's how Bonaventure characterizes this. Likewise, we've got to remember that this is the man who let his fate as either somebody who would become a hermit or a preacher be decided by his own brothers. He set aside his will in his entire life's purpose at one point to people who were members of his order in the beginning. This is not the action of a man who's trying to point me. So to read this in such a manner is, I don't think it's congruous with the rest of his life. Well, okay, so there you go. So he's already playing the role of a holy man to appear to people as pure. Yeah, so he's basically saying, he's making it up. Which, of course, doesn't really follow with the rest of the life of St. Francis. Like, why go to the lengths of asceticism? Actually, maybe not asceticism, bodily asceticism. But why go through all of that? Why starve yourself to death? You could argue that Francis was insane. You could argue that he was mentally ill. And why is it that God would grant miracles in his presence? Why is it that he would develop the stigmata? Why is it that he would develop all of these different things? Why would we have an entire spiritual movement develop out of him that points to an authentic development in the Western tradition if he was really so unholy? And don't you think that if he was so arrogant, we would see greater manifestations of this? Like, is this going to be the one manifestation? Why would there be this one? Like, why would this one action somehow show that he is so arrogant, and yet everything else in his life is so deeply contrary to this? This is a man who, on seeing a facially disfigured, very ill man, a man who had like a face-eating disease or something, he kissed him. Now, if someone were arrogant and so concerned with themselves, why would they put themselves at risk? This was a man who went to leper colonies and drained the fluid from their wounds. What kind of arrogant man, who is by definition self-seeking, would put himself in such harm's way? Now, by all means, you could argue that Francis, on the basis of this, is crazy, but arrogant? What sort of arrogant man puts himself at risk in such a manner? Okay. And of course, the people who are already having new ideas about his sanctity say, "Oh, how humble this man is." And actually, there is fake humility, not a humility. He is conscious of himself being a holy man. He said, "I do not see in myself any sin which I have not expiated by confession and repentance, for the Lord, in his mercy, has presented me the gift of clearly recognizing at prayer that in which I have been pleasing to him, and that in which I have not been pleasing." So, Francis basically says, I've been to confession, I've confessed my sins, and I've repented, and I've received a certain revelation, which is something that Orthodox fathers receive as well. He says this, I believe, I don't know when exactly he says this, I'm pretty sure he says it at his death. So, I mean, what else are you supposed to do? He has received this revelation. He lives... This is a man, like, this is one of the things that Seraphim ignores. Francis was somebody who wept so much for his sins that he developed an eye infection. Like, there's a story in this, actually, about... I can't remember if it's... I think it's the eye infection. In any case, like, he has to be sent to a doctor. I'm not sure if it's for this. Now I'm saying I should have looked over this book a little bit more. But in any case, he wept for his sins in the same way as Elder Ephraim on Mount Athos. In the exact same manner. So, calling this spiritual self-satisfaction is nonsense. And now we can contrast this. And Francis knows that he pleased God. This is the spirit already of the Pharisee. Okay? So then explain everything else. At his deathbed, St. Francis says, "Behold, God calls me, and I forgive all my brothers, both present and absent, of their offences and errors, and I remit their sins in so far as this is in my power." Now, he was not a priest, so even in that indirect sense, he has no power. That is, he had some kind of recognising in himself the power of sanctity by which he can remit the sins of people, which is totally unorthodox. Okay, so let's actually look this up. Because the context shows something different, and the Orthodox shouldn't really be throwing this around. Let me... Actually, I'll go for... What's the word? Okay. So this is towards the end of his life. So, actually, I'm just going to read this whole paragraph because it gives a good context. "So after he rested for a few days in the place he had so gently longed for, and knew that the time of death was imminent. He called to him two brethren and his specially loved sons, and bade them in exaltation of spirit sing, with a loud voice, praises to the Lord concerning death which was near, rather life which was so close at hand. While himself, as he was able, broke into that psalm of David. I cried unto the Lord with my voice unto the Lord I made supplication. But a certain brother among the company, whom the saint loved with a very great affection, and who was in great anxiety on behalf of all the brethren, said to him, when he saw these things, and knew that his end was approaching, Ah, kind father, your children remain fatherless now, and are being bereft of the true light of their eyes. Remember then the orphans you are leaving, forgive them all their faults, and rejoice them all both present and absent with your holy blessing. See, my son, answered the saint, God is calling me. I remit all the offences and faults of my brethren, as well absent as present, and so far as I may, I absolve them. So, the context here is that this isn't actually sacramental confession, because if it were, then the penitent would state his sins. No sins are stated. So it's a bit of a weird sacramental confession. Now, you could say... Actually, I'm going to put this here. Now, you could say, oh, it's still his intent is still to do a sacramental confession, or to actually absolve sins. In which case, we could say, well, fine, but I don't think that makes sense, considering there's no confession of sins going on. But there's also a view in the Orthodox Church from certain saints among them, specifically Saint Simeon the New Theologian, who we consider a saint as well, I believe, that and he's wrong on this, of course, that there were certain... Actually... Yeah, that there were certain people that could indeed do this. So I was thinking, is this a really bad faith argument to be making? Like, we can do whataboutism as well. Like, this of course doesn't mean that either church holds this view, but to say St. Francis of Assisi is some sort of not saint for this, and then to have Saint Simeon the New Theologian say the same thing. And this is according to at least two sources. One of them is granted Callistus Ware, who I'm sure that Rocor aren't particularly keen on. To say this is a little bit weird. Okay, continually going on. Again, typical of this kind of sanctity is an incident in his life when Christ supposedly appeared to him at prayer and offered him whatever favour he might desire. Already this is romance and all fairy tales, free wishes and so forth. Okay, so then, with Elder Joseph, did the uncreated light not appear? Did he not see the energies? Should we consider that a fairy tale too? What about when Seraphim of Sarov were transfigured in front of Motovilov? Should we consider this to be mere delusion? I'm sure that there are people who actually think in that case it might have been, because Motovilov was known for having mental problems. But we can do all this like fairy tales kind of thing, but like we can do that too. There's no point doing it. Okay, so he was not a priest. Oh yeah, here we go. Free wishes and so forth. But this kind of familiarity of a saint with God is typical of preless spiritual deception. And Francis asked, since he was very much burdened with his love for men, that a plenary indulgence be granted to all who confess and visit his chapel at the centre of the order. And Christ agreed, but said the Pope must ratify. Of course, because that's Catholic teaching and has been since the beginning. The Pope did this. And from that day on, day to this, on August 2nd, you can get a plenary indulgence by going to his chapel, receiving confession, which means that you will not have to suffer the temporary or temporal consequences of your sins. I mean, okay, so like you don't suffer any time in purgatory. Yeah, there's no temporal consequence if you have no attachment to sin. Otherwise, it's a partial indulgence. Yeah, and of course the Pope can do this. He has the power to bind and loose. A whole new system of indulgences, of course, is exactly already in this 13th century and already here. Yeah, it goes back a few centuries, actually, before this. But nonetheless, it's there in the seed of the faith. there's one thing more, which is the most striking characteristic of this so-called sanctity. In fact, the most striking characteristic of his deception... This is the funniest bit as well. That is, he imitated Christ in an outward manner. When he had his first, I believe, 7 or perhaps 12, probably 12 and starts with 7, he took them together and sent them 2 by 2 to go and preach the gospel. 1, 2, he went himself to France, supposedly to France, 2 to someplace else, England, Italy, and so forth. In fact, actually, interesting story, when the Franciscans landed in England, they hadn't updated their rule, and because of their poverty, they didn't wear shoes, and so you had these very early Franciscans walking around in the snow bleeding. So they were intense dudes. There's a reason why Western Europe was so taken up with the Franciscans, because they were intense. And he used the very words of the gospel. I am sending you 2 by 2 to go and preach the forgiveness of sins. First of all, he sent them to Christian countries, and only later he sent them to non-Christian countries. Well, you mean like when the Colivades fathers were preaching a spiritual renewal inside of the Orthodox countries? What about Cosmas of Aetolia? Right, he goes around Orthodox lands preaching the faith to Greeks. He's killed in Albania by the Muslims, I believe. Right? He does exactly the same thing. So to have Seraphim here criticizing Francis for doing the same thing that Saint Cosmas of Aetolia is doing, and for the same reasons, a spiritual revival, and that's just assuming that everyone's Catholic, and they aren't at this period. It's not consistent. And this also forgets that there's really serious problems near where Francis is living. You have the rise of the Cathar heresies, which are dualist Gnostic heretics. I mean, are they Gnostics? They're called Manichaeans by the contemporary authors. They believe in 2 gods, basically, an evil god and a good god, and the world of matter is evil, I believe. And they also have this... They did horrible things, like they would take pictures of Jesus and Mary with their eyes crossed out and walk around with them, right? And you also had the Valdensians, who were a proto-Protestant movement, who sort of did the kind of Francis thing, but like they were declined by the papacy. There's probably a lot of nuance there, but I'm not entirely sure. Like, there are heretical movements all over the place. And, you know, you could consider Catharism a completely separate religion. To suggest that there wasn't some sort of serious thing to fight would be to miss the point. In fact, the Franciscans actually took part in converting the Cathars to a large extent with the Dominicans. First of all, he sent them to non-Christian countries, Christian countries, as if he is teaching a new gospel. As if this had not already been done, as if he is a new Christ, sending out his own people who are preaching his gospel. Because the countries already have their bishops there and their priests, and this is why I have the rule open. Because this is more clear in the modern rule of St. Francis, which says that you're supposed to communicate with the local bishops. Yeah, okay. So this is Rule 17, and this is on preaching. And this is from the unconfirmed primitive rule. This is hosted by the Capuchin friars. No brother may preach contrary to the forms and institutions of the Holy Church unless it has been conceded to him by his minister. They did not disobey... Like, this runs completely contrary to Francis' spirit anyway, because he takes his brothers and he goes to Rome to get confirmation. So it would seem really strange that he wouldn't coordinate with the bishops. And granted, the Franciscan friars were a large pain to certain priests. Particularly, I recall reading a book about the time of the Black Death, where the parish priests were really not keen on the Franciscans, because they would offer the confessions in a different way, right? But to say that they didn't at least intend on obeying the bishops, and this is another thing again which Bonaventure insists, you know, obedience to the papacy, obedience to the legitimate structure of the church, is there. Okay. Indeed, they go and they found the Franciscan order under the Pope, who had been there in some form or another since Peter. And there's a claim here about him blessing bread and having it broken before he died, and I can't, and, you know, I haven't even looked up the source, but, okay. You know, St. Paul says that we should imitate him as we imitate Christ. Now, granted, I don't know if this is true, but hey-ho. Again, there's a very interesting thing which happened to him when he received the stigmata, which are the marks of the wounds of Christ. 5 marks in the hand, in the side, and in the feet. Before receiving this, which the Catholic Church has accepted as a real sign of a saint, he prayed that he might suffer what Christ suffered in soul and body, and, to quote, that I might as much as possible feel with all my being that limitless love which thou didst burn, O Son of God, and which caused thee to endure so many torments for us sinners. This is a brazenness which is unheard of in true saints. That they want to have God's love itself, and they want to suffer what he suffered feeling the flesh. Well, yes, that's what charity is. You don't have saints without charity, which is God's love. This is not spiritual striving. This is a search for bodily sensations and the great pride. What? Okay. Contrast this with any. Christ does appear to saints. And you can contrast this with any. Christ does appear to saints. He appeared to Saint Seraphim as he was serving as a deacon in church. Saint Seraphim did not pray, manifest yourself to me, or make me feel as you felt. He was praying in church. Christ appeared to him. He did not even want to speak about it. Yes, because different saints have different reactions to things. You know, you have, let's compare Jeremiah and Isaiah in their reaction to the mission which God gave them. Isaiah said, "Here I am." You know, he said that he would do it. Jeremiah said he wasn't worthy. Are either of them lesser saints? No, of course not. We wouldn't say this. So why would St. Francis of Assisi's reaction to God's presence make him any less of a saint than Saint Seraphim of Sarov? And then when he received the stigmata, there was a vision of a seraphim with Christ crucified superimposed on it, which came to him and which we'll show to you in one of the icons of this, shoots out rays, sun rays, and gives him the stigmata. And at this time, according to his life, Francis felt totally transformed into Jesus, which is blasphemy. It doesn't mean he's literally Jesus. Nobody believed... Francis didn't believe that he was literally Jesus. Like... he embodies the suffering of Christ, sure, that's what the stigmata represents, but it doesn't mean that he's literally the hypostatic union. That is the root of the whole Catholic spirituality, this sweetness that Jesus is approaching. I am all one with him and he is with me. All of this is prelest. All of this is the Song of Songs. Christ is the bridegroom, the church is the bride. Are we not to become one with God if we're not in the bride? I'm going to check the chat quickly. I've heard the Orthodox say that St. Francis suffered from prelest. Now I see where they got it. Reading about him, I'm seeing parallels to online hypodoxy. Toll houses. Some of the more recent online Orthodox arguments have been absolutely ridiculous, and I'm kind of appalled that we have to address them. You see, the thing is I don't think that this is a view held by the vast majority of Orthodox. I think this is held by a very small minority. I think that most of the Orthodox know better than to start playing saint fight. And I think that we should too. There's no reason to attack their saints, and there's no reason for them to attack our saints. Like, particularly not someone like Francis. Okay. Okay, so let's see. And later, surely enough, his disciples called him... Okay, so then you've got Saint Ignatius Bryankianov, who comes out with some interesting takes. Like, for example, he once... is it Bryankov? Actually, I'm not going to say it because I'm fairly sure, but I don't want to say it because the memory deceives. But apparently, Francis died and was lifted up to heaven. God beholding him did not who was great at... Okay, like there were some strange Franciscans, but I don't think this is the view of the Catholic Church. I'll be honest. And he'll talk about some of the stranger Franciscans later on. Like he'll talk about Joachim of Fiore, who had this whole idea of an age of the Holy Spirit, right? But what he doesn't address is that The church really wasn't keen on this, and the very same Bonaventure who wrote this, he replaced that wing, the previous general, the previous leader of the Franciscans, precisely to suppress this kind of apocalyptic attitude within the Franciscan order, because it wasn't orthodox. But of course, if the papacy had found any of this really weird stuff, if it wasn't, of course, if it was leading him into actual heresy, then he wouldn't be a saint, because he'd be a heretic. Okay. This kind of sanctity spirituality is already much worse than the rationalism of scholasticism. Because this means that you can have rationalist teaching in your seminaries and still be a holy person, still cling to the source of the spirituality. But when the standard of spirituality becomes this deceived, presumptuous thing full of pride, which he hasn't proved, then the route is completely closed off. And so it is, obviously, that this kind of spirituality, and this is already 1200, the end of the 11th, into the 12th, even the 13th century, 100 years after the schism, 150 years later, concept of spirituality is so different from the East. It's not that different. The difference is that they don't have stability. They don't stay in a monastery. They are poor men and poor women who renounce. They're chaste. They are poor. They have obedience, and they travel the world and they preach. And some of them have their own monastic houses, or monastic-style houses. The Capuchins have this, for example. It's not that wildly different. It really isn't. The only difference is that they can travel. They're not bound to any particular place like a Benedictine. Okay, so this would be a classical example of a person living in pre-lust. Well, it's obvious that this was simply bound up with his, and he had apparently very strong power. I don't even know the laws of these kinds of lots of going on. The followers of Francis. Oh yeah, and then he goes on about Joachim Fiore, who is someone I'm not going to defend because I don't know anything about him. And I know that he was replaced by the more orthodox, the less strange maybe. The more normal. You see, I can't say anything that isn't an insult. Like the more conservative branch of the Franciscans under Bonaventure. So I'm not even going to bother approaching them. So we'll have some questions here if people wish to ask them. I'm willing to stay on for a bit. Yeah, okay. Gloff agrees. Yeah, I agree. Most of the Orthodox I know in real life are wonderful people. Yeah, I don't think that the majority of Orthodox hold to this kind of view. I think that it is a I find this was mostly something that was irritating me. I don't think this is seriously a view that most of the Orthodox hold to. In fact, I know even of one Orthodox who said that Francis of Assisis was actually a hesychast, which is their kind of monastic practice. And to be honest, that's the impression I largely got out of him as well. I got the distinct impression that Francis of Assisi was basically a monk who had a slightly different style of rule from a typical Benedictine. That was the impression I got out of his life reading Bonaventure. He's not a radically different figure, although there were groups that did try to portray him as such. So, it's, I don't know why they bother to attack, like, Francis of Assisi of all people. Like, you can go after, there's all kinds of things you could do. It's kind of like when people try to impugn the reputations of a lot of good Protestants. Because there were good ones. Now, there are some that do deserve it. But, there's no sense going after a lot of them. Because it just makes you look bad. And this is all that, like, what's the point? That's my view. But anyway, if people don't have any questions, I'll log off. And I'm thinking of doing other streams in future, probably responding just like this. Like, I got a proper job, a full-time job, so I'm not so able to make the properly processed videos. I could probably still do it if I organise my time better. But I'm thinking of doing more responses to things. So, with any luck, in future videos I'll be a bit more erudite, because like this was basically me completely ignoring the page of notes that I made. I completely ignored these. I really should have used them. But that is what it is. Alright, so thanks a lot, guys. If you have any suggestions for videos, stick them in the comments section, and I'll respond to them. I'm thinking of, like, we'll keep it Christian for now, but I'm thinking of expanding outwards. I'm going to check with my spiritual director first, though. So I'll see you fellas later. Goodbye.